The starting point of every missing child investigation is simple. Who last saw the child alive and when? It is the anchor from which timelines form, search grids expand, and investigative decisions gain direction. In the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont, that anchor does not exist. The question sits at the front of this case like a closed door. When was the last time anyone outside the family actually saw Gus? It is a confronting question because it forces the story back to its foundations. Without an independent sighting, everything that follows rests entirely on the account provided by those within the homestead. In most Australian cases involving young children, there is a neighbour, a teacher, a shop worker, or a passerby who can confirm a recent sighting. Someone remembers a wave, a voice, a moment of ordinary life. Here, no such confirmation has been publicly identified. The final image of Gus is a single photograph, undated in the public record, and the only description of his movements on the day comes from within the station itself. The absence of that external verification is not a small detail. It shapes the entire framework of the investigation. A child's last verified location is supposed to be a fixed point, an unshakable fact. When that point is missing, the ground becomes unstable from the first step. Without a verified sighting, officers and search crews must accept a version of events without any independent corroboration. In a landscape as vast as the South Australian outback, that uncertainty spreads quickly. What follows is equally unsettling. There were no footprints around the area where Gus was said to be playing. No scuff marks, no small depressions in the dirt, no signs of running or climbing. Forensic tracking conditions at Oak Park were ideal for capturing ground disturbance. Dry soil, loose top-layer dust, and open space normally retain impressions far longer than many people expect. Nothing consistent with the movements of a young child was identified. No partial prints, no overlapping tracks, not even signs of older play. There were no toys, no clothing items, and no everyday objects that typically accompany a child outdoors. The mound, described as his play area, appeared bare. Photographs taken from the roadside show a section of ground that looks untouched, lacking the irregularities left behind when children move across the same spot over multiple days. Beyond the physical environment, there were no calls to neighbours, no pleas to the wider community, and no urgent public appeal from the family. A parent's voice calling for information is a familiar moment in missing child cases across Australia. It is confronting, emotional, and often raw. Its absence here is noticeable. Silence, in this context, becomes its own form of information. It reflects a gap where urgency would normally appear. Even during the earliest phase of the search, when adrenaline is high and hope is still strong, there were no reports of chaotic activity around the property. No mention of family members sweeping the paddocks, calling the child's name, or moving rapidly along vehicle tracks in the fading light. There was no footage of a mother or father at the SES staging area. The usual signs of panic, disorder, movement, desperation were simply not visible. Oak Park itself is a quiet expanse of land, shaped by heat, distance, and the isolation typical of outback pastoral stations. In such places, sound carries, and movement is easily noticed. Yet the setting feels suspended, as though the land absorbed the event without leaving any trace. The homestead appears almost frozen in the images that circulated. Stillness becomes part of the narrative, reinforcing the sense that something fundamental is missing long before the search begins. This silence, not only from the environment, but also from the people closest to the child, forms the first major contradiction of the case. A 4-year-old does not simply vanish without sound, without trace, without a footprint or a witness. Outback investigations rely heavily on physical clues because the land rarely lies. When trackers find nothing, when dogs detect no scent, when infrared sweeps reveal no heat signature, and when human witnesses remain limited to a single household, the core assumption must be examined. Was the child truly there at the time he was reported missing?
This is the point where the initial discomfort of the question becomes unavoidable. It challenges the natural instinct to accept the first version of events, and instead demands a return to the basics. A missing child investigation cannot be built on uncertainty at its foundation.
If the last confirmed sighting is unclear or unverified, investigators must consider whether the disappearance occurred earlier, elsewhere, or under different circumstances entirely. The difficulty is that this question is emotionally loaded. It carries implications no one wants to state without care. In Australian true crime cases, caution is essential. To ask whether a child was present is not to assign blame. It is to clarify the timeline. Without clarity, every search grid, every interview, and every forensic step risks being misdirected. Cases like William Terrell and Azaria Chamberlain demonstrate how fragile early narratives can be when initial assumptions go untested. This does not mean those assumptions are false. It simply means they cannot be trusted blindly. The starting premise of this investigation relies entirely on internal accounts. With no external witness and no physical evidence confirming the child's presence, the question becomes the spine of the entire documentary. What do we actually know? And what do we only believe because the alternative feels too uncomfortable to consider? The tension between those two possibilities, known fact versus accepted assumption, is what makes this question so heavy. It explains the unease expressed by many Australians following the case. It explains the persistent doubt, the theories, the frustration, and the continued demand for clarity. When the disappearance of a 4-year-old begins with an unverified whereabouts, the case moves out of the realm of the ordinary and into something far more complex. The first hook for the viewer, then, is not sensational. It is stark in its simplicity, and powerful precisely because it is so basic. If no one saw Gus, if no trace shows he was there, and if the land itself offers no sign of his presence that day, what exactly are we working from? The absence of an independent sighting places a shadow over the timeline, suggesting there may be more we do not yet understand. In most missing child cases, the public is presented with a series of photographs, school pictures, family snapshots, birthday moments, videos taken casually on a parent's phone. These images build a sense of the child as a living presence, someone with habits, expressions, and a rhythm to their days. With 4-year-old Gus Lamont, the public has seen only one photograph, a single still frame. No confirmed date, no accompanying video, no alternative angles, no updated images showing how he looked in the weeks or months leading up to the day he was reported missing. The photograph itself is simple. Gus appears small, with soft features typical of a child his age. There is a gentleness in his expression, the kind that invites automatic empathy. His stature, his build, and the way he holds himself convey the vulnerability of a child still learning about the world around him. For many viewers, the image evokes a feeling of quiet fragility, the sense that this is a child who needed protection, routine, and careful supervision in a harsh environment. Outback Australia is beautiful, but unforgiving. A 4-year-old in that landscape is immediately understood as someone at risk, even under ideal circumstances. The limited nature of the available imagery has expanded this concern. A single photograph becomes the entire public identity of a missing child, and with that comes an unavoidable heaviness. It raises the question of why there is only one. Families typically provide multiple images to authorities and media during a search. Police encourage this, as different angles and outfits can assist the public in recognizing the child. Photographs taken months apart can help identify subtle changes: longer hair, a different build, a new preference in clothing. The absence of such images in this case has left a gap that feels larger than it should. For many Australians following the story, this lack of visual record contributes to a deeper unease. People expect, in the digital age, that parents and relatives will have dozens of images stored on their phones. They expect videos of a child playing, running, laughing, or speaking. Even families living remotely tend to document small moments, particularly in early childhood.
When no such material is shown, the public instinctively wonders whether more images exist but have not been shared, or whether the child had been seen less frequently than assumed. This is not an accusation, it is an observation about how information, or the absence of it, shapes perception. In the context of a missing child, imagery does more than provide identification. It offers reassurance that the child was part of a daily routine, occupying space in the world in a way that can be verified by more than the official narrative.
The absence of recent photographs removes that reassurance, leaving the public to fill the gaps with their own questions. There is also the matter of confirmation. No independent images have emerged showing Gus in the days leading up to the reported disappearance. There are no community sightings, no photos from local events, no short clips captured by visitors to the station. In remote areas, these confirmations are sometimes sparse, but they are rarely absent altogether. Pastoral regions might host contractors, delivery drivers, shearers, mechanics, or government workers, any of whom might notice a small child on the property. In this case, no such confirmation has been reported. The lack of visual documentation contributes to a sense of distance between the public and the boy at the center of the investigation. Without additional imagery, the child becomes suspended in a single moment, a moment that may or may not reflect his appearance at the time he was reported missing. It creates an emotional disconnect. People want to care, want to understand, want to visualize the child as he truly was, but they are offered only a single still image, frozen in time. This emotional distance is compounded by the absence of personal detail from those closest to him. No stories about his favorite toys, no mention of routines, no reference to his personality beyond general descriptions. In other cases, families often share details to help searchers understand how the child might react when scared, tired, or lost. Whether he would hide, whether he would approach strangers, whether he knew the land, whether he had a tendency to wander. Here, those insights are missing. The silence leaves the public without even the smallest anchor to the child's inner world. For many viewers, this void creates a feeling that goes beyond concern. It becomes a quiet frustration, not directed at any individual, but at the lack of information needed to recognize Gus as more than a statistic. A missing child is not just a name or an age. They are a person with a life that should be visible through photographs, words, and memories shared openly during the search. When those elements are absent, the case feels uncomfortably hollow. At the same time, the single image carries a weight that multiple images never would. It becomes symbolic. It becomes the only point of connection. Every discussion, every article, every analysis circles back to that one photograph. And while it evokes empathy, it also heightens the question of why the public has nothing else to rely on. The emotional impact of this absence is significant. People who follow Australian true crime cases often speak about the feeling that a child was not being protected. In this context, that feeling is tied not only to the events of the day, but to the lack of evidence showing the child's everyday presence in the weeks before it. Images help confirm care. They confirm routine. They confirm existence in a shared world. Without them, the narrative feels incomplete in a way that no amount of official explanation can resolve. As the photograph circulates, the stillness within it becomes sharper. The boy in the image cannot move, cannot age, cannot speak, cannot clarify. All that remains is an unanswered question wrapped in the quiet face of a child who deserved far more than silence. And it is that silence, visual, emotional, and factual, that invites a deeper reflection. Not a confrontation, but a gentle, persistent unease. A thought that lingers softly. Why would a child living an ordinary life be represented by only one publicly released photograph? In any disappearance, the timeline provided by those closest to the child becomes the scaffolding on which the entire investigation rests. It is a sequence of moments, often brief, often ordinary, that suddenly take on enormous importance once a child is declared missing. In the case of 4-year-old Gus Lamont, the publicly known timeline is both simple and fragile.
Simple because it contains only a handful of events. Fragile because none of these events have been independently verified, and the physical environment offers little support for the sequence described. According to the family, the afternoon unfolded in a familiar pattern. Gus was said to be playing outside near a mound of dirt not far from the homestead. The adults were reportedly inside or nearby, engaged in routine tasks. At some point in the late afternoon, as daylight began to fade, someone called him inside for tea. When he did not respond, the family checked the yard.
Within minutes, the child was declared missing. A search was initiated. Police were contacted later that evening. At first glance, this appears consistent with many cases where a child wanders from a rural property. But when examined with forensic attention to detail, timing, visibility, terrain, and the physical abilities of a boy his age, the timeline begins to feel less solid. The first point in the sequence is the playtime itself. The family's account suggests that Gus was outdoors alone, in an area adjacent to the homestead. The ground in this area is flat, exposed, and largely free of thick vegetation. Forensic tracking conditions would normally be favorable, soft enough to capture impressions, dry enough to retain them, and open enough to allow visibility from the house. According to experienced trackers and search volunteers, a child as small as Gus would leave light but readable disturbances in the soil. These would include scuff marks, partial prints, signs of turning or climbing, and patterns of repetitive movement typical of young children. Yet, none of these indicators were observed. The next point is the call to come inside for tea. In many rural households, this is a daily marker, a vocal cue heard clearly across open ground. A 4-year-old familiar with routine would usually respond, even if by calling back or moving towards the house. The reported lack of response, combined with the absence of any audible distress or movement, becomes an early anomaly. In the stillness of the outback air, sound travels easily. Even from a distance, a child's footsteps or voice often reach the house. In this case, nothing was heard. The moment of discovery, when the family realized Gus was no longer in view, is another critical point. Depending on the layout of the property, adults inside the homestead would normally have intermittent visual access to the yard, particularly if aware that a child was playing outside. The mound, described as the play area, is visible from certain angles, but partially obscured by a tree or shrub in others. This partial obstruction may explain some uncertainty, but it does not fully account for the complete absence of observable movement in the moments before the alarm was raised. When the family began looking around the property, daylight would have been declining. Light conditions around dusk in South Australia shift quickly, but not instantly. There is usually a brief period of soft, diffused light in which ground disturbances can still be seen. Search crews who arrived later described the area as lacking any clear path, trail, or footprints leading away from the homestead. This absence stands in contrast to what would normally be expected from a young child moving across loose soil. Environment conditions also factor into the assessment. Weather records from the region indicate warm afternoon temperatures and a dry surface layer. These conditions tend to preserve prints and scuff marks, particularly in the hours immediately following their creation. A child wandering off would likely leave a pattern that, while not perfect, would still provide directional cues. Trained trackers reported finding none. Distance adds another layer to the analysis. A 4-year-old can typically walk between 1 and 2 kilometers in an hour, depending on terrain, fatigue, and emotional state. In the fading light, disorientation would be expected. The search radius that night included nearby tracks, dam edges, and open paddocks. Helicopters deployed with infrared capability scanned the area. No signs of a child's movement or body heat were detected. For this to be consistent with the timeline, the child would have had to move quickly, silently, and without leaving trace, a possibility that becomes increasingly unlikely when weighed against typical child behavior. Another point lies in how quickly the family concluded that the child was missing. Reports suggest that the realization occurred within minutes of the initial call. Families often spend a short time checking obvious hiding spots, behind objects, inside sheds, near machinery.
In this case, the timeline leaps rapidly from "called for tea" to "child missing," with little detail about intermediate steps. This may reflect shock or the constraints of public reporting, but it nonetheless introduces another gap. The final part of the timeline concerns the call to police. Missing child protocol in Australia emphasises early contact, especially as night approaches in remote areas.
The exact timing of the call has not been publicly confirmed, but its placement within the timeline is important for assessing search effectiveness. Any delay, even 30 minutes, can significantly complicate tracking and reduce the clarity of ground impressions. Across all these elements, the question is not whether the family believed the timeline they described, it is whether the physical environment and known behavioral patterns align with that description. When the sequence of events is cross-checked against soil conditions, distances, light levels, and the movement patterns of young children, inconsistencies emerge. Each inconsistency alone may be explainable, but together they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. If the timeline is accurate, the land should reflect some evidence of movement. There should be faint tracks, disturbed dust, or signs of hesitation or wandering. Experienced trackers should find partial impressions at minimum. Search dogs should detect a scent trail, even if weak. Infrared equipment should identify anomalies in heat patterns. Instead, each method returned the same outcome: no trace. The silence of the ground, combined with the simplicity of the described sequence, leaves an unresolved tension. A small child crossing open soil does not vanish between 1 minute and the next without leaving evidence. The land is honest, and when it shows nothing, the timeline requires closer examination. In this case, the examination leads to a quiet, lingering question. Not confrontational, not accusatory, but unavoidable in its logic. If the timeline unfolded exactly as described, why did the land show no sign of a child's movement at all? The place identified as the final location where 4-year-old Gus was said to be playing is a small rise of dry soil not far from the Oak Park homestead. From a distance, it appears unremarkable. A mound shaped by wind, machinery, or simple erosion, sitting in the open with no shade, no equipment, and no objects suggesting regular use by a small child. In many investigations, the area described as the last known position becomes the most scrutinized part of the landscape. It is where searchers expect to find impressions, discarded items, faint disturbances, or at least something that confirms a child interacted with the space. Here, however, the ground tells a different story. The surface of the mound appears smooth, with no obvious scuffing, no loose debris pushed aside, and no variation in soil texture that would normally result from repeated play. Young children tend to move energetically, often returning to the same spot, scrambling up and sliding down, creating shallow grooves or compressed patches. These patterns build up over days and weeks. Even a single afternoon of activity usually leaves irregular marks, small footprints, kneeling indentations, or drag lines where hands or shoes have disturbed the dust. The absence of these indicators has become one of the most striking aspects of this location. There were no toys present, not a bucket, not a spade, not a ball or a stick deliberately placed. Children living on rural properties often play with improvised objects, climbing structures or worn-down plastic items used for digging or marking out imaginary paths. It is rare to see a child's play area completely bare. The fact that nothing of this kind was observed adds another layer of uncertainty. A space used by a 4-year-old typically contains small reminders of their presence: a dropped item, a favorite object, something forgotten in the moment of being called inside. The absence of these elements leaves the mound looking less like an active play zone and more like an idle patch of earth. Search imagery also suggests that there were no slide marks or shifting of soil along the sloped edges of the mound. When a child repeatedly climbs a rise, the soil tends to compress under small feet. Loose grains fall, creating slight channels. Edges become softened. Even if winds later pass over the area, the compacted sections usually remain intact for a period of time. None of these familiar signs were publicly reported. The mound appeared featureless,
its surface unbroken by the irregular patterns expected from a child's movement. The lack of older footprints is just as significant as the lack of new ones. A play area used frequently shows layers of past activity. Some marks overlap, some blur, some fade with time. But unless heavy rain or the passage of vehicles completely resets the ground, these older traces remain recognizable to experienced trackers.
The fact that neither fresh nor aged footprints were identified suggests either that the mound had not been used for play recently or that the described play did not occur in the way it was communicated. This brings into focus the expertise of Aboriginal trackers involved in the search. Tracking in dry country is an advanced skill, drawing on deep cultural knowledge, environmental awareness, and acute observation. These trackers read the ground in ways that go beyond visible footprints. They look for disruptions in soil structure, changes in pressure, variations in color, and the fine dust patterns disturbed by movement. A child's presence is detectable even when full prints are not. The light step of a 4-year-old creates subtle indentations, particularly at the heel and toe, that disrupt the top layer of dust. These disruptions may be faint, but they do not vanish instantly. Dry soil, such as that around Oak Park, tends to hold impressions longer than wet or compacted ground. In these conditions, even hours after activity has ceased, trackers can identify directional hints. If Gus had been playing actively on the mound in the late afternoon, remnants of that play should have been visible. Aboriginal trackers consistently noted the absence of such evidence. Their observations underline a key forensic point. In this environment, no sign of play is not an ordinary outcome. The surrounding area also offers little to support the notion that a child was present. There were no small footprints leading toward or away from the mound, no wandering paths, no back and forth patterns, and no signs of hesitation or meandering. Children rarely move in straight lines. They tend to stop, pivot, test surfaces, chase insects, or become distracted by stones or sticks. These behaviors leave an irregular but recognizable trail.
The lack of such a trail in the soft earth is difficult to reconcile with the idea of an active 4-year-old spending time in that location shortly before dusk. Visibility from the homestead is another point of consideration. While the mound is partially obstructed by a tree or shrub, it is still close enough that adults inside the house would likely notice movement, especially given the openness of outback yards. The stillness of the area, combined with the absence of noise or disturbance, amplifies the sense that the space had not recently been in use. Even in quiet play, children often make small sounds, talking to themselves, shifting gravel, running small objects along the ground. None of these were reported by those present. Environmental factors also deserve attention. Dry soil in semi-arid regions preserves impressions for hours unless significantly disturbed. Wind, on the day in question, was moderate, but not strong enough to erase all traces within the tight time frame described. Without rain or heavy activity by adults, animals, or vehicles, the groundwork should have retained at least faint evidence of a child's presence. The complete absence of such evidence stands at odds with what would typically be expected under these conditions. In examining this location, what emerges is not a confirmation of wrongdoing, but a factual inconsistency. A place identified as the final sighting of a child should show some sign of that child's presence. Instead, the mound appears untouched, a space without life, interaction, or interruption. This disconnect does not produce answers on its own, but it does intensify the need for further clarity about why this particular spot was designated as the last known location. As investigations unfold, physical evidence becomes the backbone of reconstruction. When that backbone is missing, and when the environment itself contradicts the described sequence of events, it invites a quiet but persistent question about the reliability of the information provided. It is this quiet tension between the described narrative and the silent, undisturbed ground that shapes the central reflection of this section. If this area holds no trace of a child's presence, what led to it being identified as the place where Gus was last seen?
In Australia's most remote landscapes, where the soil speaks louder than any witness, Aboriginal trackers have long held a reputation for clarity in situations clouded by uncertainty. Their knowledge is not theoretical, it is lived, inherited, and shaped by generations who learned to interpret the land with a level of precision that modern forensic tools often struggle to match. In missing child cases, their presence is not symbolic. It is vital.
When the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont was reported at Oak Park, trackers were among those brought in to assess the ground. Their role was straightforward: read the soil, identify movement, and determine whether a child had traveled through the area. To them, even the smallest disturbance, a light shift in dust, a subtle compression, a pattern of weight distribution, can reveal direction, pace, and state of mind. In dry country, a child's passage almost always leaves a readable trace. Here, they found none. This absence is not a simple detail. Trackers do not expect perfect prints. They do not need the clean, heel-toe impressions familiar in suburban sand. Instead, they look for micro-patterns, crushed particles, slight color changes, the faint collapse of the top dust layer, irregularities in how wind settles over disturbed soil. These signs may be invisible to the untrained eye, but to a tracker, they form sentences. A cluster of them becomes a paragraph. And a long trail becomes an entire story. On the mound, identified as the supposed play area, trackers reported no signs that a child had been present. The soil was unbroken, the top layer intact, the pattern of dust consistent with long-term stillness rather than recent activity. In their assessment, the ground showed no evidence of climbing, sliding, sitting, or shuffling, all behaviors typical of a 4-year-old at play. Their conclusion was delivered with professional restraint. If there were no tracks leading away from the mound, then the child did not leave that area on foot. In contexts like this, such a statement carries significant weight. Trackers are not prone to speculation. They focus only on what the earth confirms. When they say there are no tracks, it means the land has genuinely not been disturbed. And when the land is undisturbed at a location where a child was reportedly active moments before disappearing, the discrepancy becomes difficult to ignore. The tracking findings are further strengthened by the performance of search dogs. Scent tracking dogs, particularly those trained for missing person searches, rely on ground disturbance, sweat trace, microscopic skin particles, and changes in airflow to pick up a trail. Even in dry, open country, they are capable of following a child's scent for considerable distance. But like the trackers, the dogs found nothing. No directional pull, no fading trail, no points of interest. Handlers describe the dog's behavior in such cases as neutral, not confused, but unconvinced that a target ever passed through the area. The absence of scent can occur for two main reasons. Either the child was not present recently, or the child was not present at all. Both possibilities widen the uncertainty around the reported timeline. Above the ground, the air search offered no further clarity. Helicopters equipped with infrared capability scanned the surrounding kilometers.
These sensors detect heat signatures, picking up anything warmer than the landscape: people, animals, machinery. Even if a child is lying still, infrared typically identifies a temperature difference unless heavily concealed. Yet the search returned a uniform reading. Nothing suggesting recent movement. Nothing indicating a resting body. No signs of a child seeking shelter from the approaching night. Horseback search units added another layer of assessment. Riders can cover uneven ground more effectively than vehicles, scanning both the soil and surrounding brush at a closer vantage point. This method is particularly effective in semi-arid terrain, where small disturbances can hide behind rocks, shrubs, or tire ruts. Again, nothing was found. No broken twigs, no flattened spinifex, no threads of clothing on fencing wire. Every technique, human, canine, mechanical, echoed the same silence.
Together, these results form a collective picture. The area where Gus was reportedly last seen does not behave like a place where a child recently moved. In missing child investigations, it is rare for every method to return the same blank outcome unless the child never traveled through the area in question. This does not imply intent or identify cause. Instead, it underscores a forensic truth. Movement leaves evidence. Absence of evidence can occasionally be explained by environmental interference, but environmental interference did not occur here. There was no heavy rain, no overnight wind strong enough to erase prints from structured soil, no livestock passing through that could reasonably obliterate tracks. The ground conditions were calm, dry, and conducive to preservation. The silence of the landscape, therefore, becomes its own form of testimony. Respect for Aboriginal trackers means taking their interpretations seriously.
Their skill set is not mystical. It is practical, precise, and extensively proven in both policing and community search operations. Their involvement at Oak Park reinforces what many viewers of this case have felt instinctively. The physical evidence does not support the idea that Gus walked away. This finding does not replace formal investigation, but it does demand careful consideration. If the earth says no child walked across it, and if trackers and dogs agree, then the narrative must be reassessed through a different lens. In investigative practice, conflicting information is not a conclusion. It is a prompt to widen the scope of inquiry. Other possibilities emerge: timelines that differ, movements that occurred elsewhere, or events that did not involve the play area at all. At this stage of the analysis, such possibilities remain theoretical, but they illustrate why the absence of tracks is more than an inconvenient detail. It is a foundational contradiction in the reported sequence of events. This contradiction leads to a natural, quiet question. Not accusatory, not confrontational, but shaped by the evidence, or, more accurately, the lack of it. If the earth shows that no one traveled across that ground, what does that mean for what truly happened that day? In any missing child case, investigators pay close attention not only to the physical evidence, but also to the behaviors of those closest to the child. This is not about blame. It is not about assuming guilt. It is about recognizing that high-stress situations tend to produce certain predictable patterns. When those patterns do not appear, or when the behavior falls noticeably outside the expected range, investigators look more closely. Not with judgment, but with caution. In the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont, the public has observed a series of reactions that feel unusual, particularly when compared with other Australian cases involving missing children. These behaviours have become a point of unease for many who are following the story, not because they prove anything, but because they do not align comfortably with what communities are accustomed to seeing when a child vanishes. The first noticeable element is the absence of visible distress in front of the media. In numerous missing child cases, from remote communities to metropolitan suburbs, family members often appear visibly emotional when speaking publicly. Tears, tremors in speech, or expressions of desperation are not unusual. They are considered normal human responses to extreme fear and uncertainty. In the Oak Park case, however, no family member has shown such outward signs in the public sphere. There have been no emotional appeals, no visible displays of panic or sorrow. While it is important not to impose a single template for grief, the complete absence of outward emotion has stood out to many observers. Connected to this is the lack of a plea. Public pleas are not required by law, but they are a consistent feature of missing child investigations. Families often stand beside police and ask the public for help, beg for information, or speak to the child directly. These appeals serve two purposes. They show engagement and they expand the circle of search efforts. In this case, there has been no such plea. No request for assistance, no message directed at the child, no invitation for the public to contribute information. The silence has created a sense of distance, as though the family is not participating in the search in the way communities normally expect. The third behavioral point concerns searching. Families typically search relentlessly in the early stages of a disappearance. They join volunteers, walk the property, comb the streets or bushland, and remain physically close to the search site.
It is common for parents to refuse rest, driven by the fear that their child is somewhere waiting to be found. Reports from Oak Park indicate that the family did not engage in sustained searching beyond the initial moments. There were no public sightings of extended searches, no accounts of family members working alongside SES or volunteers, and no visible presence near the command post. Again, this does not confirm wrongdoing. Some families shut down under stress or rely heavily on authorities, but the near absence of searching has raised questions simply because it contrasts with expected patterns. Perhaps the most discussed behavior is the absence of Gus's mother from the public narrative. For several weeks following the disappearance, she did not speak to media, did not appear at the property during reported visits, and did not release any statement. While privacy is a right, prolonged invisibility during a missing child investigation is unusual. In many cases, mothers are the most vocal advocates for their children, even when under immense psychological strain. Her absence has therefore become a point of public concern, not because it suggests guilt, but because it interrupts the typical flow of information and engagement seen in similar situations. The behavior of one grandparent added a sharper edge to the unease. In a widely reported incident, a grandparent allegedly confronted a journalist with a firearm. Such behavior is not only unsafe, but also highly irregular in the context of a missing child investigation. Families dealing with profound fear may act unpredictably, but aggression towards the media is not an expected response. More concerning still was the perception that authorities appeared to accept or excuse the behavior. This unusual tolerance created an impression, fair or not, that the investigation was operating under constraints or pressures not typically present. Another behavioral gap involves the absence of updated images of the child. Only one photograph of Gus has been circulated publicly, despite the importance of visual identification in missing child cases. Families generally provide multiple photos, recent images, different angles, different clothing. These help the public identify the child and assist in search efforts. The lack of additional images has puzzled both viewers and professionals. It raises questions about access, willingness, and transparency. When a child is missing, more images usually lead to more leads. In this case, the single static image has served as the only point of recognition, and no further visual information has been released. Behavioral analysts often begin with two baseline profiles: the reactions of families who are genuinely in crisis and the reactions of families who hold back information, for any reason. Neither profile is definitive. Humans are complex, and trauma affects people in unpredictable ways. But across decades of cases, patterns have emerged. Families who are open, overwhelmed, and desperate to find their child typically engage early and consistently. They speak, they show emotion, they cooperate broadly, and they allow public scrutiny if it means reaching the child sooner. Families who are withholding information, whether out of fear, guilt, shame, or a desire to protect someone, often display restricted behavior. They may avoid public attention, limit their involvement, or behave defensively when approached. In the Oak Park case, the behavior observed aligns more with the latter pattern than the former. This alignment does not prove deception. It simply means the family's responses fall outside the set of behaviors most commonly seen in missing child cases where the family is fully engaged and transparent. From an investigative standpoint, these behavioral markers would typically prompt further questioning, closer monitoring, and a deeper exploration of internal dynamics. In the public arena, they have created an atmosphere of uncertainty. One additional factor that complicates interpretation is the apparent lack of unified messaging from the family. In many disappearance cases, family members present a consistent narrative. They issue joint statements, work together, and maintain cohesion. Here, silence from some members contrasts sharply with visible tension from others. The combination of absence, hostility, and fragmented communication contributes to a broader perception that something within the family dynamic is unsettled or unresolved. It is important to emphasize that families in crisis are not required to behave in a way that satisfies public expectations.
Cultural, psychological, and personal factors all influence how individuals respond to trauma. Some people shut down, some withdraw, some reject media involvement entirely. But when every primary behavior falls outside the range commonly seen in similar cases, investigators and the public naturally pause to consider why. Behavioral analysis does not accuse, it observes. Its purpose is to highlight inconsistencies between expected and actual responses. In this case, those inconsistencies are numerous. They do not answer the question of what happened to Gus, but they do contribute to a growing sense that the official narrative remains incomplete. Taken together, the behaviors form a pattern that is difficult to reconcile with the urgent, open, and emotionally charged responses typically seen when a child disappears in remote Australia. Instead of clarity, they introduce ambiguity. Instead of mobilization, they produce silence. Instead of unity, they reveal distance. And in that distance, a quiet, persistent thought settles in. One shaped not by accusation, but by the contrast between expectation and observed reality. If the family's goal is truly to find Gus, why do so many of their actions point in the opposite direction? In Australia, the first 48 hours of a missing child investigation are critical. Every police officer, SES volunteer, and investigator working in this field understands the protocol. Secure the scene. Establish a reliable timeline. Search the immediate environment thoroughly and treat the home as a primary source of evidence until proven otherwise. These steps are not optional. They exist because experience has shown, time and time again, that early decisions determine whether a child is found and whether the truth is uncovered. Against this backdrop, the response at Oak Park stands out for what did not happen. Standard procedure begins with a full search of the residence. Bedrooms, sheds, cupboards, floor cavities, water tanks, vehicles, and outbuildings are all checked. Children have been found in unlikely spaces, under beds, inside linen cupboards, behind appliances, in storage rooms, even beneath floorboards. These checks are thorough because they save lives. At Oak Park, however, there is no public indication that the homestead was searched with this level of rigor. Reports suggest that attention moved quickly to the surrounding land, as though the story of a wandering child was accepted almost immediately. A second foundational step involves cadaver dogs. Despite their confronting name, these dogs are not brought in to assume the worst. They are brought in to rule out possibilities quickly.
Their purpose is to detect traces, clothing, bedding, objects that may carry scent, or locations where a body has been moved or concealed. In many Australian cases, cadaver dogs are deployed within hours. At Oak Park, they arrived significantly later, long after the land had been disturbed and after critical windows for accurate scent tracking had passed. Vehicle checks are another cornerstone of early investigation. Cars, utes, trailers, and machinery are routinely examined for signs of recent transport, soil disturbance, fibers, or biological material. These checks do not imply suspicion. They simply ensure that every avenue is accounted for. In this case, there is no public evidence that the family's vehicles were inspected promptly or at all. This omission becomes particularly relevant when considering the remoteness of the property. If a child leaves a homestead by vehicle, the landscape will not provide tracks, no matter how skilled the trackers may be. Interviews are equally important. In most missing child cases, family members are separated early, not because they are presumed guilty, but because fragmented recollection is clearer when individuals speak privately. When families are interviewed together, narratives can unintentionally merge. One person's memory can influence another's, and details can be lost. Separating interviews allows investigators to compare accounts, identify inconsistencies, and clarify gaps in the timeline. At Oak Park, there are indications that key individuals were not interviewed separately in the early hours. This missed opportunity may explain some of the ongoing uncertainty, as initial statements often anchor the direction of an investigation. Layered across these procedural issues is a broader concern: the perception that police were following the family's lead rather than directing the investigation themselves. In remote communities, relationships between police and locals can be complex. Officers may rely heavily on cooperation to maintain access and safety. But cooperation must not override investigative independence. When a family strongly presents a particular narrative, such as a child wandering off, there is a risk that this narrative becomes the foundation of the search before alternative explanations are fully considered. The behavior of certain family members, including displays of aggression toward media, may have contributed to a cautious or deferential approach from police. High conflict situations in isolated settings can place officers in a difficult position. They may prioritize de-escalation over assertive investigation. While understandable from a safety perspective, this shift can lead to delays in critical tasks such as property searches, interviews, and forensic checks. Resourcing may also have played a role. Remote regions often operate with limited staffing, limited equipment, and slower access to specialists. Helicopter availability, dog units, and forensic teams may take longer to arrive. Yet, even within these constraints, certain procedural decisions remain within local control. The choice not to secure the home immediately, not to establish a strong perimeter, and not to begin systematic questioning early cannot be fully explained by resourcing alone. Another factor may be the timing of the report. The disappearance was reported on the evening of the AFL Grand Final, one of the busiest nights for emergency services across the country. High demand periods can create delays in response coordination. But delays do not typically account for the absence of basic protocol once officers arrive at the scene. Even with stretched resources, the core steps of a missing child search do not change. What stands out most is the contrast between the vast scale of the land search and the limited scrutiny placed on the immediate environment. Helicopters, horses, drones, SES volunteers, and police spread across kilometers of outback terrain. Yet the homestead, the vehicles, and the internal dynamics of the family were reportedly left largely unexamined in the early stages. This imbalance reinforces the impression that the investigation began with an assumption rather than a question, that the child had walked away, rather than disappeared under unclear circumstances. Investigators with experience in rural disappearances often refer to a simple framework. The search begins inside, moves outward, and only then expands to large radiuses. At Oak Park, the process appears to have started from the outside and stayed there. Once a search pattern is established, it can be difficult to shift course. Time passes, evidence degrades, and opportunities narrow. The earliest hours, when the truth is most recoverable, cannot be revisited. None of these observations imply misconduct. They do, however, highlight procedural gaps that affect the likelihood of finding clear answers. When the land provides no tracks, when dogs find no trail, when helicopters detect no heat, and when behavioral patterns raise questions, the investigation becomes heavily dependent on the strength of its early decisions. If those decisions missed critical steps, the entire structure that follows becomes vulnerable. As the case developed, public frustration grew, not because the community expected instant answers, but because they recognized how unusual the investigative path appeared compared to other Australian missing child cases. Many expressed confusion about why foundational steps were overlooked, why certain checks were delayed, and why the investigation seemed to follow the family's version of events without testing it adequately against physical evidence. Across all of these elements, a single, measured question forms at the center. Not accusatory, but grounded in basic investigative reasoning. What circumstances led to an investigation that left so many fundamental steps undone? When a disappearance offers almost no confirmed facts, the investigation naturally shifts towards structured hypotheses, each one tested not through speculation, but through what the land, the behavior patterns, and the fragmentary timeline allow us to consider. These hypotheses are not accusations. They are investigative tools used to examine the consistency of a narrative when evidence is either scarce or silent. In the case of 4-year-old Gus Lamont, 5 major hypotheses emerge,
each reflecting a different possible pathway through the events at Oak Park, and each presenting its own degree of alignment with the physical and behavioral indicators.
The first hypothesis is the one initially presented by the family. The idea that Gus wandered away from the mound, where he was reportedly playing, became disoriented in the fading light and continued walking further into the outback. This scenario appears at first to be the simplest explanation, and in many missing child cases across rural Australia, it has been the correct one. But here, the land itself contradicts it. Aboriginal trackers found no footprints or soil disturbances of any kind. Ground search teams observed no scuffing or directional trails. Scent dogs could not pick up even a weak trace, and infrared searches revealed no heat signature consistent with a child moving across open country. The mound showed no signs of recent play, no disturbed soil, no sliding marks, no toys, no old prints. A wandered-off scenario requires visible movement. Here, the environment showed none. For this hypothesis to hold, nearly every expected environmental and behavioral indicator would need to fail at once, which is extremely unlikely. The second hypothesis, an accident followed by concealment, aligns more closely with what investigators often observe in rural settings. Accidental deaths can occur quickly and quietly. Falls, machinery incidents, misjudged distances near pits or water sources. When panic follows, especially in isolated or complex family environments, concealment can occur not out of malice, but out of fear, shame, or confusion. This hypothesis accounts for several aspects of the case: the lack of tracks, the absence of searching behavior from the family, the limited engagement with police and media, and the unusual timing of the report. If a significant accident occurred elsewhere on the property and the scene was staged or misunderstood, the untouched soil around the mound becomes logical rather than puzzling. Hebral withdrawal, avoidance of media, and reluctance to provide further images of the child all fall within recognized patterns seen when a family is withholding information due to panic or guilt. This hypothesis does not specify who might have been involved, only that an internal event could explain the physical silence of the land. A third hypothesis is that Gus was not at Oak Park at the time he was reported missing. This does not imply intent. It simply reflects the absence of any independent confirmation of his presence that day. No neighbor saw him, no updated photograph was taken, no video exists, no physical evidence links him to the mound, no scent trail begins from the yard. Had a child genuinely been in that environment, the soil should reveal it. The fact that it does not raises the possibility that the reported last seen location is not the true one. This hypothesis gains weight because it is consistent with every major forensic outcome: the lack of tracks, the lack of scent, and the lack of disturbances. It does not assert when the child was last truly seen, only that the scene presented to police may not reflect the actual moment of disappearance. The fourth hypothesis, removal by vehicle, offers another structurally coherent explanation. If a child left the property in a ute, trailer, or other vehicle, then the land would show no trace and dogs would lose scent immediately. Helicopter infrared would not detect movement on the ground because there would be none. In remote properties, almost all travel occurs by vehicle, and the absence of early vehicle checks is a significant investigative gap. Without tire impressions examined, interiors inspected, or load areas tested, a major avenue of inquiry remains open. Removal by vehicle does not presume foul play. It could occur accidentally or under disorganized circumstances. But its forensic implications are clear. Vehicle transport neutralizes environmental evidence, which is precisely what occurred. The fifth hypothesis involves the possibility of withheld information by one or more individuals. Behavioral analysis does not confirm guilt. It identifies atypical patterns. In this case, several such patterns exist: a lack of public plea, the absence of visible searching, the prolonged disappearance of Gus's mother from public view, aggression toward journalists, no updated images, limited cooperation, and controlled communication. In many missing child cases, fragmented or defensive behavior suggests internal conflict or knowledge not being shared. Silence may stem from fear, trauma, distrust, or attempts to protect another person. Whatever the cause, withholding information disrupts investigative clarity. It also aligns with the unusual emotional flatness and restricted engagement seen in this case. When these 5 hypotheses are weighed against all known evidence, or more accurately, the absence of evidence, a pattern forms. The wandered-off scenario struggles to survive forensic analysis. The accident and concealment hypothesis fits well with both behavioral and ground-based indicators. The possibility that Gus was not present aligns with the complete silence of the soil. Removal by vehicle explains the total absence of tracks or scent. Withheld information explains the unusual behavior and lack of transparency. Each hypothesis carries different implications, but only some hold structural coherence when applied to the available details. The purpose of presenting these possibilities is not to select one narrative over another. It is to understand which explanations can withstand scrutiny and which collapse under basic environmental logic.
When a child vanishes without leaving any trace, no prints, no scent, no objects, no disturbance, the investigation must consider not just what could have happened, but what the land refuses to support. Across all 5 hypotheses, one quiet but unavoidable question emerges, shaped by the sum of everything the search failed to find. Which scenario fits not only the evidence we have, but the profound absence of evidence everywhere we look? In the long history of missing child investigations, certain cases sit heavy in the collective memory because they reveal not only the fragility of early evidence, but also the ways in which assumptions, pressure, and narrative gaps can distort the search for truth. 3 of the most recognizable examples: the disappearance of Madeleine McCann in Portugal, the case of 3-year-old William Tyrrell in New South Wales, and the disappearance of infant Azaria Chamberlain near Uluru, each carried a distinct cultural footprint. Yet despite their differences, they share a series of structural patterns that are uncomfortably familiar when viewed alongside the developing picture at Oak Park. One of the most significant commonalities is the lack of a clear, independent last witness. In all 3 cases, the final confirmed sighting of the child came from within the family group or from individuals closely connected to them. Without external verification, timelines became fluid. Moments became harder to anchor. Investigators faced uncertainty about the exact time, place, and circumstances in which each child was last seen alive. That ambiguity opened the door to speculation, and speculation soon altered the public perception of each case. The absence of a verified last sighting did not prove wrongdoing, but it made the reconstruction of events vastly more difficult. The same structural void exists in the disappearance of Gus Lamont. No independent witness has confirmed seeing the child at Oak Park on the day he was reported missing. Without that anchor point, the timeline becomes reliant on a single narrative, and as past cases show, a narrative without external stabilizers can shift easily under scrutiny. Another shared pattern is unusual or inconsistent family behavior, not as a marker of guilt, but as a feature that complicates public understanding and investigative momentum. In the Madeleine case, shifts in parental accounts fueled widespread suspicion. In William Tyrrell's disappearance, a series of fractured statements, unclear relationships, and later emerging details produced years of confusion. With the Chamberlain case, the mother's composed public demeanor was misinterpreted as evidence against her, rather than an expression of shock and trauma. These cases reveal a difficult truth. When family behavior does not align with the public's expectations, interpretation becomes emotional rather than factual. Assumptions flourish, pressure intensifies, and the investigation, rather than being guided by physical evidence, becomes entangled in the behavior of those at its center. At Oak Park, the absence of public pleas, the limited participation in search efforts, and the periods of withdrawal by key family members have all contributed to an atmosphere of uncertainty. These behaviors do not determine the outcome, but history shows that they strongly influence how the investigation is perceived and how the community engages with it. The third shared pattern is the presence of early investigative errors, mistakes that cannot be undone once time passes and evidence fades.
In the Chamberlain case, misinterpretation of forensic material became one of the most significant failures in Australian legal history. In William Tyrrell's disappearance, early assumptions about abduction drew attention away from alternative scenarios. In the Madeleine McCann case, delays in securing the scene and inconsistencies in early questioning created irreparable gaps. In all three, the absence of a controlled, methodical first response shaped everything that came after. Once a search is misdirected, or once a home is not secured, or once a key witness is not interviewed properly, timelines develop blind spots. At Oak Park, the absence of early cadaver dogs, the lack of a thorough property search, and the failure to treat the homestead as a primary scene echo the structural weaknesses seen in these earlier cases. These are not identical situations, but they share a common vulnerability. The truth becomes harder to find, not because it is hidden, but because the earliest opportunities to locate it were lost.
Taken together, these historical cases demonstrate a worrying pattern that extends beyond the specifics of any individual investigation. When crucial early steps are skipped, when narratives are accepted without testing, and when the public is left without clarity, the path forward becomes increasingly narrow. Investigators lose critical ground, the community loses confidence, and the child, the person at the center of every urgent decision, becomes harder to find. The comparison is not intended to draw equivalence between the cases, nor to imply shared outcomes. Rather, it offers a lens through which to view the Oak Park disappearance with a wider perspective. Each past case reveals how quickly confusion can harden into certainty, how small investigative gaps can grow into large structural problems, and how the absence of independent evidence places extraordinary pressure on every other piece of information. Perhaps the most important lesson comes from acknowledging what hindsight consistently shows, that clarity in the earliest hours is invaluable. And when that clarity is missing, a case can drift for years. In all three historical examples, truth emerged slowly, sometimes painfully, and often only after public opinion had already formed rigid conclusions. In the Chamberlain case, it took decades for Australia to recognise that the initial narrative was wrong. In the Tyrrell case, investigations have shifted repeatedly between competing theories. In the McCann case, unresolved questions remain to this day. Viewed alongside these examples, the disappearance of Gus Lamont carries not just the weight of one family's tragedy, but the weight of a country's experience in how these cases unfold. The absence of a last witness, the behavioural ambiguity, and the procedural gaps form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. They are not evidence of one particular outcome, but they are indicators that Australia may once again be entering familiar territory, a space where uncertainty becomes the defining feature and where the truth becomes harder to reach with each passing day. As viewers reflect on these parallels, a quiet, steady question begins to surface. Not sensational, not accusatory, but shaped by everything Australia has seen before. Are we witnessing a new case unfold, or are we watching an old pattern repeat itself in another form? As this examination draws to a close, we return to the question that has quietly shaped every section of this investigation. Was there ever any confirmed evidence that 4-year-old Gus Lamont was at Oak Park on the day he was reported missing? It is a confronting question, not because it points to any one conclusion, but because it highlights the silence that sits at the center of the case. Across the property, the soil showed no movement.
The dogs found no scent. The infrared search detected no heat. The play area offered no signs of recent use. And no independent witness came forward to place the child at the homestead that afternoon. In forensic terms, the absence is total.
This does not tell us what happened to Gus. It does not identify who knew what or when. But it does make one fact inescapable. There is no physical, independent, or environmental evidence confirming that the child was present at the scene described as his last known location. The weight of that truth falls quietly, without sensationalism, yet firmly enough to shift the way the case must be understood. When a missing child investigation begins without a confirmed last sighting, every subsequent step becomes more uncertain, every assumption more fragile, and every search effort more vulnerable to misdirection. Throughout this analysis, the focus has remained on the land, the behavior, the timeline, and the investigative process.
Each element reveals a small part of the broader picture. Together, they paint a portrait of a case defined not by what was found, but by what wasn't. In situations like this, clarity rarely arrives quickly. The truth emerges in fragments, through re-examination, through time, and often through the courage of someone who decides to speak. That point matters more here than in many other cases. A 4-year-old cannot explain what happened. A child cannot correct the record, challenge a narrative, or protect their own story. When the evidence is silent, when the land holds no trace, and when the people closest to the child offer limited clarity, the responsibility to pursue answers shifts outward, to investigators, to communities, and sometimes to strangers who simply refuse to look away. Across Australia, those following the Oak Park disappearance have expressed the same sentiment, that the public seems more active in searching for truth than those who were present at the homestead.
This frustration is not rooted in anger. It is rooted in the instinct to defend the vulnerable. In every missing child case, the smallest voice belongs to the person in greatest need of protection. And when that voice is absent, the public often becomes its echo. If someone, somewhere, holds information about what happened to Gus, whether about the timeline, the location, the events of the afternoon, or details that seemed insignificant at the time, now is the moment to step forward. Not out of accusation, but out of recognition that even a small detail may anchor the truth. Silence protects no one, least of all a child who cannot protect himself. 4-year-olds rely entirely on the adults around them. They cannot safeguard themselves from harm, they cannot navigate isolation, and they cannot make their way across a vast outback station without leaving marks behind.
When a child disappears without a single trace, it is not the child who has failed to make themselves visible. It is the circumstances around them that have failed to make their world safe. And so the case returns, steadily and quietly, to the central absence, the missing evidence, the unanchored timeline, the stillness of the soil. These gaps do not accuse, but they do demand answers. They demand clarity, not for the sake of public interest, but for the sake of a little boy whose story remains unfinished. As this chapter closes, one thought rises gently above the noise that has surrounded this case. If we do not speak on behalf of Gus, if we do not continue to question, to examine, and to push for transparency, then the silence surrounding him will only deepen. Every child deserves a voice, and when that voice is lost, it becomes the responsibility of others to carry it forward.
And so, as viewers reflect on everything laid out in this investigation, a single question remains. Not to corner anyone, but to encourage honest thinking and clear-eyed reflection. Do you believe Gus was truly at Oak Park on the day he was reported missing?